Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 74 of Society and the State. Connor here, along with Brian, to interview Professor Tom W. Bell about an intoxicating idea you're going to love. And this idea is, should the government itself be subject to competition? Professor Bell, Tom, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Brian.
So you've written a couple things, both of which, several, obviously, on this issue. We're going to link to them on the show notes page for our listeners. That's societyandthestate.com/74. There's, in particular, a fee article that caught my attention about this concept of polycentric law. That's kind of a mouthful. And then you've written a book a few months ago called Your Next Government, From the Nation State to Stateless Nations. Let's kind of unpack this a little bit if we could. Maybe let's start with the definition of the term polycentric law. What does that mean, and how does it relate to kind of this broader idea that you're promoting?
Polycentric law is a term used to distinguish methods of governance from monocentric law. And most people at a first cut, when they're not being very reflective, think about government as monocentric. They imagine there's sort of one authority, whether it's a king or a legislature, but one authority that issues the laws, and we follow them or we get in trouble. In a polycentric system, there's a number of overlapping and competing authorities who together create an environment where people are peaceful and can live together in kind of cooperative ways, but at the same time living under slightly different rules. And that is, in fact, the world we live in. One of the things about polycentric law it does for you, that perspective, it kind of opens your eyes to the fact that is the kind of world we live in. And most people get it pretty quickly. It's just kind of a new word. And you explain that, hey, look, I mean, you could go to a church and they could tell you what to eat. You could work at a business and they could tell you, what kind of stuff you can look at on your laptop when you're at the office. And, of course, there's municipal governance, tells you zoning. Federal government tells you what you can and can't smoke, et cetera, et cetera. Many authorities.
Now, many authorities kind of broadly speaking from all walks of life, religion, business, education, perhaps sports, insurance, cable companies, everything else, right? You've got all these different competing authorities in the various aspects of your life. But is it the case that anywhere in the world, so one of the pushbacks, of course, is, well, interesting idea, but when has it ever worked, right? So are there any examples, historical or recent or in the recent present, about polycentric law actually working on a governmental political level?
Well, yes, Connor, and indeed, again, that is the world we live in, whether people realize it or not. Now, sometimes we have overlapping authorities because there's sort of a bigger boss. You have the federal government, and it kind of bosses us around hard. And then you have the states. But there's more to polycentricity than that. It depends on how you define law. And I like Lon Fuller's definition. Law is the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to the governance of rules. And so you and I, everybody in America, lives under many different polycentric rule sets. So at one and the same time, again, you can have someone who says, the most important thing in my life is how I worship God, and I have a number of rules I follow for that. Mm-hmm. And then there's some other rules I follow from another source. Let's move away from America. I mean, there's been whole civilizations. Northern Europe in the medieval era was very polycentric. You had various city-states. You had the Holy Roman Empire. There were very many overlapping authorities, and that is what gave Northern Europe, arguably, its freedom, in contrast to more monocentric societies like, say, classical China or India.
I find that really interesting, and I think part of the tantalizing I don't know what to say, the temptation or the allure, I should say, that's the word I'm going for. The allure of this idea, for me, for others I've spoken with, I don't really use the term polycentric law just because I think I'd lose people, but I talk about, competition in government. And what I say is you think of any monopoly, people kind of inherently know, especially more free market minded people, that monopolies are inherently bad. Costs go up, quality goes down. We wouldn't want monopoly in potato chips or cable companies or, textbook manufacturers or anything else. And so applying that same thing to government, people quickly concede, well, yeah, we do have a monopoly. Like if you think of, as you point out, there's kind of layers of government, there's federal and state and municipal. But just thinking about it from a municipal government, to start small and local government, people are subjected to these rules and they don't really have an option to choose. For where they live, it's a monopoly. And so is it your thesis, is it your suggestion that we need, for example, I could live in location X, and rather than having a municipal monopoly government in that area, I would have some options of municipal government from which to choose?
Yes, I think we would be better off moving towards that world. We're sort of there, but once we recognize, hey, there's this option, we could actually have competition in governments, then you can start saying, well, how do we get more of that at the margin? There's already some of it going on. There's some real benefits to that. Can we get more of it? And municipally, you mentioned, Connor, municipal government. Well, actually, that's an area where Americans, at least, something like around 25% of Americans now live in basically private municipal governments. They live in HOAs or condominium associations. They live in private organizations that provide many of the amenities that formerly they got from traditional municipal governments, like parks, like security, like fire protection. When you live in an HOA or a big condo complex, you're getting all that stuff privately. And it's because why? Because you tried living in the city and it was trashy. And, the police weren't very polite. And so you went to a place where you could get a better service. You got to pay for it. But in America especially, other countries too, surprisingly. Actually, China has a lot of these private communities. It's kind of an aspect of Chinese government a lot of people miss. But at any rate, yes, municipal government, a lot of polycentricity.
So Brian has a question, but before he jumps in, I want to ask a quick follow-up. As I've talked about this issue, I think one of the biggest problems is this idea of friction. How difficult is it? Or maybe better explained, mobility. If I have the ability to quickly, conveniently, cheaply make a decision between two competing alternatives. Let's say ice cream brand A and B, and I don't lose anything if I choose A versus B, then all of the incentives are in my favor because those manufacturers are competing for my dollar, and I can easily choose between the two without really giving anything up. And so I win. I, the consumer, maximize my choice, maximize my benefit. But the problem is, if in choosing ice cream B, I had to go on, like a keto diet for 3 weeks beforehand or whatever, like I have to sacrifice a lot in order to choose one. That's not really fair competition. So here's where I'm driving this question. If I have to move to choose a different government, your contention is we kind of already have polycentric law a little bit, and I'll concede that. I think that's very reasonable to suggest, especially because it helps people kind of understand the idea and that it's not this foreign concept. But if I have to move, if I have to relocate, sell my home, get a different job, leave my family, whatever, in order to choose a different government, then the incentives do not work as efficiently in my favor because the government, the state, the municipality knows that it would be very difficult for me, so they can get away with a lot of abuse, raising taxes, et cetera, because they know it's very unlikely that people are going to uproot themselves en masse and leave. Whereas if we had some sort of system in which I could choose from municipality government A, B, or C as easily as I choose between different cable companies, cell phone companies, insurance companies, then just like the ice cream, the incentives are in my favor because I don't have friction and I have easy mobility. So would you agree, or can you kind of flesh that theory out from your perspective that we maximize the benefit of the consumer if we reduce the friction, if we make it very easy for them to me, that's the intoxicating idea of polycentric law, because we make it very easy for people to choose between governments without having to uproot their lives. We remove that friction.
Okay, and by the way, Brian, I understand you have a question too.
That's okay. I'm patient.
You're not being forgotten. So basically, you're applying good, sound economic analysis to governance, and I say, hooray for you, sir. I agree, of course. And we're just asking, how can we get more of it? And I agree with you that lowering transaction costs is very important. It's hard to have competition if people have to incur terrible costs to make choices. And I'll say, smart people are working hard at that. I'm also academic director, in addition to being a Professor Chapman, author of this book, Your Next Government, which, by the way, talks all about this stuff. I'm academic director of the Institute for Competitive Governance, and it engages in research and development of ways to increase competition between government services by lowering transaction costs. So I'll give you some examples of how this could happen. One is, I've already given you, HOAs and condos and such. You do have to move into an HOA, but you don't have to leave town. I mean, I've done this myself recently. It's not that hard. You just, you pack up your stuff and you move. People do that all the time. It's not super easy, but it's not that hard either. Uh-huh. Another way that we can choose the law is through choice of law clauses in contracts. Now, this is not something you and I probably do unless we're drafting contracts. It's more something businesses do. But it is possible for a business that operates in many states to say, we like the state law of California more than the state law of, say, New York, where we also have an office for various reasons. And so they put in all their contracts these choice of law provisions that say, even if you're in New York City and your contract with us, if you get in a struggle with us, some kind of disagreement, California law is going to apply. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty costless, low cost anyhow, way for people to just do a contract clause to choose the body of law that applies. I'll give you one more example. I've actually advocated, I've written a paper about this as a chapter in my book, Your Next Government. I've advocated creating United States special economic zones. The United States has a variety of special jurisdictions, but not ones that you and I can benefit from because they're mostly for businesses. And I've advocated, hey, let's open up more competition, frankly, for the federal government by setting aside parts of the country where different rules than the usual federal rules, like, say, different tax rules, apply, and make it so that these areas are places you and I, Connor and Brian, we can move to. We'd have to move, but it wouldn't be any worse than, say, moving from, say, California to Utah. You kind of up your family, you move to another opportunity. People do that all the time. Mm-hmm. It's easier than moving to Europe, at least.
Well, I'm pretty sold on the idea of government needing competition. Given how many people sometimes conflate illegal and legal with moral, or with moral questions like right and wrong, I'm curious, do you feel like there's any advantage to the government having competition in terms of moral authority?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we already have that, really, as I've noted. I think it's fair to call churches sources of law in a very real sense. I mean, they issue rules that really constrain behavior. And sometimes, in fact, government courts will recognize the decisions of ecclesiastical courts. And sometimes government courts will say, well, we're going to let this religious rule determine whether or not you're married under their rules. So churches have a lot of bite in the sense of how they influence people. And of course, I think you could argue pretty much every rule that comes out of a church is ethical in some sense, concerns morality in some sense, not just matters of what's economically efficient.
Are there other institutions besides church that might also compete for that moral authority?
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, that's a pretty loose term, moral authority. I mean, you could say if someone chooses California law versus New York law, California law does not like, for example, constraints on competition. You enter a contract and your employer says, hey, after you leave the job, you can't go into competition with us for a year. In California, courts sneer at that. There's no way we're going to enforce that. And you can dress that up as a moral decision. It's because of human dignity and the right of a person to pursue their livelihood, and we're not going to let sluggish businesses exercise coercive devices on our citizens. That's kind of the view they have if they're talking in a moral tone. So, yeah, this already happens. I don't think the line between what's legal and illegal and moral and immoral is that clear. I mean, I would editorialize and say I think we could get governments out of that business insofar as possible, but I'm, not a fan of victimless crimes.
Tom, I wonder how you might respond to this idea that what you're driving towards is becoming more possible due to technology. You think of, the threat or potential threat of something like cryptocurrencies to fiat currency and nation states and the status quo. How essential or what opportunity does technology provide for shifting us from this concept of the state to kind of competition in government? We're all so used to competition now. We got Uber and we got Lyft and we got Airbnb on our phones and everything's at the tap of the finger, and we're driving consumerism by empowering each individual with choice. Is it that people are becoming so used to this that they're going to more increasingly expect it in a political sense too? How essential is that technology to drive this issue forward?
I think you're right. Yes, technology is driving it forward, and I think there's a strong possibility. It's a happy possibility. I'm an optimist. But I think there's a strong possibility we're going to have increasing range of choices in governance online, and because so much more of our lives day by day is drawn up into the virtual world, that becomes increasingly important. In fact, I'm working with people now to create basically an online legal system such that you and I, if we have a transaction through an online forum, which we're creating, an online marketplace, we would adjudicate our dispute not in the local district court, but entirely online. Judges would come online, and even the judges would come from online sources, and even the judgment would be rendered online because we would have assets which would be accessible via this online platform. So you and I are both together in this marketplace, and I claim that you didn't ship the goods that I paid for, and then I win the decision. They could actually go and seize some funds from your online account and transfer them to me. We never have to go to anybody with a badge. That's becoming more and more of an option for all of us. I think it's a good thing. It's going to allow people like you and me to say, this market works, or it doesn't. And we'll go find, it's like people now saying with regard to Facebook. Some people say, I don't like Facebook, I'm out of here, and they're leaving, and they're trying to find new places. That's going to keep Facebook better than it would be otherwise, and we should have that in all areas of life.
So where's the greatest pushback against polycentric law? I mean, I'd want to think that not just government, but maybe, I don't know, would the attorneys be opposed to this? Where do you see the greatest resistance?
That's a good question. Well, of course, your status positivists who are rife throughout academia and the hallways of government are uncomfortable with competition, right? The people who benefit from there being a monolithic, powerful state that can have the last word in what can be done are not at all happy with the idea of competition. Not much more you can say about that, except that's not surprising. The more interesting thing to me is how they dress up their opposition ideologically, because that's where the struggle that I'm engaged in takes place. I'm not actually, in the street wearing a mask or anything of that nature. Happily, very few people in this area are. It's all very civil. And the things you hear, the ideas you hear against polycentricity, I think these merit concern, they merit respect and they have to be addressed, are things like chaos. And one of the advantage of having one overarching law is you have less conflict. That's why people like world government. People have it claimed, we need a UN. All these nation states are struggling against each other, and it's bad. It creates war. There's a lot to that argument. I'm not a fan of war myself. I happen to think more government's not the solution, but that is a common trope. You see conflict, and you say the problem here is there's two parties that can oppose each other. If we just had one party, it would all be peaceful. And so, that'll get you one king, one ring that rules them all.
Tom, in the summary of your book, you describe it as that this idea of transforming government is going to be from the bottom up, inside out. And kind of building off of Brian's question, it makes me wonder, what is your view in the decades going forward, trying to shift in this direction? Do you foresee this? It sounds like being something more organic and grassroots, where empowering people with choice, they just kind of naturally demand it. And so the market, if you will, kind of responds and the political structures adapt? Or is there any way forward in which you do have the monolithic government conceding or carving out this special zone or whatever, where you have a more top-down approach, creating this opportunity to kind of incubate or pilot test something like this?
Oh, so Brian did get his question in. Good. I can't tell who's asking the question.
That's Connor.
Both things are going on. There's Connor. All right. Well, as long as everybody's questions get asked and answered. So both things are happening. My book, in large part, reports facts in the world that have already happened, not because of ideological pressures, but because this makes sense for governments. It's an amazing trend. I didn't know these facts until I wrote the book. The number of zones that have taken off, the size of zones now, and Saudi Arabia recently announced one that's going to be twice the size of Connecticut. The number of people getting into these zones, the scope of what they do. You have places like Dubai where they brought in a whole new commercial law for their international financial center, places like Honduras where they're creating entire private, really kind of private governments. Amazing stuff. But that wasn't because somebody was going around waving a little red book, saying you should do this because it's what the proletariat wants or anything like that. It's just businesses and governments doing what made sense. But there's also now, I dare say thanks to people like me, people who have noticed this and have said, hey, there's an overarching way to understand this. And once you understand the idea, then you can hit the gas on that. And people like me say, hey, yeah, look, everybody's recovering zones are a good idea. Wow, they're popular with governments. You know, you don't want to. Most libertarians are pushing against governments. I'm saying, wow, governments really like this. And now I'm just hitting the gas hard on it and saying, well, let's have more of it then, because I see a way to freedom. We say, hey, let's have some United States special economic zones, or in other works I've advocated special zones to help refugees who are kind of, nationless people. Maybe we could set up zones for them. It's this tool you can use for lots of, I think, good things. So both things. First, it's kind of facts of the world, economics and political trends, and then also now people who theorize about this and can advocate in an abstract way the ideas that are out there already taking effect.
As I've spoken about this concept of competition between governments, I've found that most people have not really entertained the idea. Perhaps we're just so used to this idea of monocentric or monolithic government, geographic determined boundaries and jurisdictions. And so I imagine that this episode is going to be very fascinating to our listeners. We are going to link to your book, to the article I mentioned on fee, and to your organization, which I had no idea about until you just mentioned it, the Institute for Competitive Governance. We will link to these on the show notes page for today, societyandthestate.com/74, so that those who want to learn more can reach out, read your work, get involved, because I think this is an exciting idea, and I hope the future is very bright in shifting us towards this. So, Professor Tom W. Bell, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about this idea of polycentric law.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.